There's nothing more heartbreaking than watching a child lose their last parent. When 8-year-old Ellie's mother dies from fever in the Montana wilderness, she's left completely alone in a world that doesn't care about orphans. She wanders the mountains looking for help until she finds Jonah, a mountain man who's lived alone for 15 years. He doesn't want anything to do with her at first, but when she asks if she can spend just one day with him, something changes. They face wild animals and dangerous men together. She teaches him about hope while he teaches her how to survive. By sunset, this hardened man who swore he'd never care about anyone again makes a promise that will change both their lives forever. What could make someone so determined to stay alone suddenly want company? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Sarah Morrison first felt the fever, she knew it meant trouble. Not the kind of trouble that comes from a bad storm or a hungry bear, but the kind that settles deep in your bones and doesn't let go. She stood at the window of their one-room cabin, watching 8-year-old Ellie chase butterflies through the wildflowers that grew thick around their little homestead. The sight filled her with equal parts joy and heartbreak, knowing what was coming. Sarah had been alone with Ellie since her husband died in a mining accident 3 years prior. They'd moved to this remote corner of Montana territory because land was cheap and the government didn't ask too many questions about a woman trying to make it on her own. She'd built their cabin with her own hands, taught herself to hunt and fish, and raised Ellie to be strong and independent. But fever was different. Fever didn't care how tough you were. The small gold wedding ring on Sarah's finger caught the morning light as she pressed her palm against the cool glass. It was all she had left of her husband, besides Ellie's bright blue eyes that mirrored his exactly. She twisted the ring around her finger, a nervous habit she'd developed since becoming a widow. Today, the simple band felt heavier than usual, as if it carried the weight of all the promises she might not be able to keep. "Mama, look!" Ellie called from outside, holding up a handful of purple lupins. Her dark hair was already escaping from the braids Sarah had woven that morning, and dirt smudged her cheek. She wore a patched brown dress that had been let down twice as she grew, and her small feet were bare, despite the morning chill. "Can we make flower crowns like you showed me?" Sarah forced a smile and stepped outside, the cool mountain air doing nothing to ease the heat building in her chest. The fever was getting worse, she could feel it. "Of course, sweetheart. But first, come help Mama with something important." Ellie dropped the flowers and skipped over, her worn rag doll tucked under one arm. The doll had been Sarah's own as a child, passed down from her mother, and now it rarely left Ellie's side. Its fabric face was faded, the yarn hair tangled, but to Ellie it was the most precious thing in the world, besides her mother. Sarah knelt down to Ellie's level, taking her small hands in her own. The fever made everything feel urgent now, like sand slipping through an hourglass. "Ellie, you know how sometimes we talk about being brave? Like when Papa had to go work in the dangerous mine?" "Yes, exactly like that." "Well, Mama might need you to be very brave soon. Can you do that for me?" Ellie nodded solemnly, though Sarah could see the confusion in those bright eyes. "How do you explain death to a child who still believes that love can fix anything? How do you prepare them for a world that doesn't care about 8-year-old girls with nowhere to go?" Over the next 3 days, the fever consumed Sarah like a wildfire. She tried to hide it at first, forcing herself to cook meals and tell bedtime stories, but her body betrayed her. By the second day, she couldn't keep food down. By the third, she couldn't get out of bed. Ellie tended to her mother with the fierce devotion of a child who doesn't understand that some battles can't be won with love and determination. She brought cool water from the well, picked flowers to brighten the dim cabin, and read aloud from the few books they owned, her small voice stumbling over the bigger words. At night, she curled up next to Sarah in the narrow bed, her rag doll clutched tight, as if her presence alone could chase away the sickness. "Tell me about the angels again, Mama," Ellie whispered on the third night, when Sarah's breathing had become labored and her skin burned with fever. Sarah struggled to find her voice, each word a tremendous effort. Angels, angels watch over little girls who are brave, even when their mamas can't anymore. Will you become an angel? The question pierced Sarah's heart more deeply than the fever ever could. She pulled Ellie closer, breathing in the sweet scent of her daughter's hair. If I do, I'll watch over you every single day, but you have to promise me something. What, Mama? Promise me you'll be strong. Promise me you'll find good people who will take care of you. And promise me, Sarah's voice broke, the words catching in her throat. Promise me you won't give up hope no matter how scared you get. Ellie nodded against her mother's chest, not fully understanding but sensing the gravity of the moment. I promise, Mama. I promise. Sarah died just before dawn on the fourth day, her hand still wrapped around Ellie's small fingers. The little girl woke to find her mother cold and still, and for a long time she just lay there whispering, Mama, over and over, as if the word itself might have the power to bring her back. When the traveling preacher came through 2 days later, following the smoke from their chimney, he found Ellie sitting beside her mother's body, still holding that worn rag doll. She hadn't eaten, hadn't moved, hadn't cried. She just sat there, waiting for someone to tell her what to do next. The preacher was a kind man, with gentle eyes and weathered hands. He helped Ellie prepare her mother's body and dug a grave on the hill behind their cabin, under the oak tree where Sarah used to sit and watch the sunset. As they lowered the simple pine box into the ground, he spoke words about eternal rest and heavenly reunions. But Ellie barely heard them. All she could think about was how quiet the world had become without her mother's voice. After the funeral, the preacher sat down with Ellie at their small wooden table. Child, you can't stay here alone. Do you have any family? Anyone who might take you in? Ellie shook her head. Her grandparents had died before she was born, and her father had been an only child. There were no aunts or uncles, no cousins, no one who shared her blood or her name. Well then, the preacher said gently, you'll have to come with me to town. There's an orphanage there and— No. The word came out sharp and fierce, surprising them both. Ellie had barely spoken since her mother died, but now her voice was clear and determined. Mama said I should find good people. She said I should be brave. The preacher studied her for a long moment, taking in her stubborn chin and the fire in her blue eyes. And how do you plan to do that, child? Ellie looked out the window toward the mountains that stretched endlessly beyond their little valley. I'll know them when I see them. The preacher tried to argue, tried to explain the dangers of the wilderness and the harsh realities facing orphan children. But Ellie had inherited her mother's stubborn streak. In the end, he could only press a few coins into her small hand and pray that somehow, against all odds, this brave little girl would find the protection she needed. After he left, Ellie packed her few belongings into a canvas sack. Her mother's wedding ring, which she wore on a string around her neck, the small recipe book where her mother had written down remedies and cooking instructions, her rag doll, and a change of clothes. She took one last look around the cabin that had been her whole world, said goodbye to her mother's grave, and set off into the wilderness with nothing but faith and the promise she'd made to be brave. The mountains rose before her like sleeping giants, their peaks crowned with snow even in late summer. She had no map, no plan, no destination in mind. She only knew that somewhere out there, good people were waiting for her to find them. Her mother had said so, and Mama never lied. 2 days into her journey through the Montana wilderness, Ellie learned that mountains don't care about promises made to dying mothers. They don't care about 8-year-old girls with worn-out shoes and empty stomachs. They only care about survival. And survival is a language Ellie was just beginning to understand. The first night, she'd found shelter under a rocky overhang, curled up with her rag doll, and tried to ignore the howling of wolves in the distance. The second night, rain had driven her deeper into the forest, where she huddled beneath a fallen log and shivered until dawn. Now, on the third day, With her small store of food almost gone and her feet blistered from walking, she was beginning to understand why the preacher had looked so worried. The mountain path she followed was barely a trail at all, just a thin line worn by deer and elk making their way to water. Pine trees towered above her, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the sky. Every sound made her jump, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a hawk. She clutched her rag doll tighter and tried to remember her mother's words about angels watching over brave little girls. As the sun reached its peak, Ellie crested a small ridge and saw smoke rising from a valley below. Her heart leaped with hope. Smoke meant people, and people meant help, food, maybe even a warm place to sleep. She half ran, half tumbled down the slope, her canvas sack bouncing against her side. The cabin that came into view was unlike anything she'd ever seen, built. From rough-hewn logs and chinked with mud, it seemed to grow out of the mountainside itself. A stone chimney sent up a steady stream of grey smoke, and neat stacks of firewood lined one wall. A small garden grew beside the house, and chickens scratched in a wire pen. But what caught Ellie's attention most was the man splitting wood beside the cabin. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that hadn't seen scissors in a long time, and a thick beard that covered most of his face. His clothes were rough and practical, leather pants, a wool shirt, and boots that had seen hard use, but it was his eyes that made Ellie hesitate at the edge of the clearing. They were the color of storm clouds, and when they fixed on her, they held no warmth at all. The man's axe froze mid-swing when he spotted her. For a long moment they stared at each other across the small clearing. Then he straightened slowly, the axe still gripped in his large hands. "Who are you?" His voice was deep and rough, like he didn't use it much. "What are you doing here?" Ellie took a tentative step forward, her mother's words about finding good people echoing in her mind. "My name is Ellie Morrison. My mama died, and I don't have anywhere to go." The man's expression didn't soften. If anything, his frown deepened. "Where's your family?" "Your kin? I don't have any. It was just me and Mama, and now it's just me." The words came out smaller than she'd intended, and she hated how young and helpless she sounded. The man, Jonah, though she didn't know his name yet, set down his axe and crossed his arms over his chest. He'd been living alone in these mountains for 15 years, and the last thing he wanted was complications, especially complications that came in the form of a lost child with sad blue eyes. "You can't stay here," he said bluntly. "This is no place for a little girl." "I'm not little," Ellie protested, though even as she said it, she realized how ridiculous she must look. "I can work, I can help with chores, I won't be any trouble." Jonah shook his head. "Child, you don't understand. I live alone because I want to live alone. I don't need help, and I don't want company. You need to go back where you came from." I can't go back." Ellie's voice cracked, and she felt tears threatening. "There's nothing back there for me. Please, mister, I won't stay long, just one day. Can I spend a day with you?" The question hung in the air between them, simple and desperate. Jonah stared down at this small girl with her dirt-smudged face and determined chin, holding a ratty doll like it was the most precious thing in the world. Something about her reminded him of things he'd tried hard to forget: family dinners, children's laughter, the warmth that came from caring about someone other than yourself. He almost said no. The word was right there on his tongue, ready to send her away and preserve the carefully constructed isolation that had kept him safe for so many years. But then he saw the way her shoulders trembled, though she was trying so hard to be brave. He saw the worn-out shoes and the too-thin frame beneath her patched dress. He saw the desperation she was trying to hide behind stubborn pride. One day, he heard himself say, the words coming out before he could stop them, "You can stay one day, but tomorrow morning you're leaving, and I'll have no more arguments about it." Ellie's face lit up like sunrise, transforming her from a scared little girl into something radiant and hopeful. "Thank you, mister. Thank you so much. I promise I won't be any trouble." Jonah grunted and picked up his axe again, already regretting his decision. "Name's Jonah Creek, and you will be trouble. Children always are. That's why I live up here where there aren't any." But even as he said it, he found himself glancing at Ellie from the corner of his eye. She was exploring the edges of his small clearing with the careful curiosity of a wild animal, touching nothing but taking in everything. When she spotted his garden, she knelt down beside the neat rows of vegetables with something approaching reverence. "These are beautiful," she said softly, running her fingers over the leaves of a squash plant. "Mama taught me about gardens, but ours was never this nice." Despite himself, Jonah felt a flicker of pride. He'd worked hard to coax life from this Rocky Mountain soil, and it meant something to have his efforts recognized, even by a child. "Takes patience," he said gruffly, "and knowing when to leave things alone." The unspoken message was clear, but Ellie chose to ignore it. Instead, she stood up and brushed the dirt from her knees. "My mama always said that growing things is like hope. You plant it and tend it, and eventually something beautiful comes up." Jonah's hands tightened on the axe handle. He didn't want to hear about her mother, didn't want to think about hope or growing things or any of the gentle philosophies that had no place in his hard, solitary life. But something in the child's voice, the way she spoke about her mother with such love and loss, made him bite back the sharp words that wanted to come. "Come on then," he said instead, turning toward the cabin. "If you're staying the night, you might as well make yourself useful. There's work to be done." As they walked toward his home, Jonah told himself this was just charity, nothing more. One night of shelter for a lost child, and then she'd be on her way, and he could return to his peaceful solitude. But deep down, in a part of his heart, who thought was dead and buried, something stirred to life, something warm and dangerous and altogether unwelcome. Behind him, Ellie clutched her ragdoll and tried to contain her relief and gratitude. She'd found someone, just like Mama had said she would. Maybe he was gruff and unfriendly, but he'd offered her shelter when he could have turned her away. That had to count for something. That had to be the beginning of hope. Neither of them realized that this moment, this reluctant agreement to one day of company, would change both their lives forever. Sometimes the most important decisions we make come disguised as small acts of kindness, and sometimes the families we need most are the ones we never see coming. Dawn came quietly to the mountain cabin, filtered through pine boughs and morning mist. Ellie woke on the narrow cot Jonah had grudgingly provided, her ragdoll still clutched in her arms, and the smell of coffee drifting from the main room. For a moment, she forgot where she was, and her heart clenched with the familiar pain of reaching for her mother and finding only empty space. But then she heard the sound of someone moving around the cabin, the clink of metal on metal, and remembered. She was safe, at least for today. The mountain man had kept his word. She sat up and looked around the small space that served as Jonah's bedroom. It was sparse and functional, with little to suggest the personality of the man who lived here. A rough wooden dresser, a few hooks on the wall for clothes, and a single window that looked out over the valley. No pictures, no mementos, nothing soft or decorative. It was the room of someone who had stripped his life down to bare necessities. The main room of the cabin was only slightly more welcoming. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a well-worn armchair positioned in front of it. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, and shelves lined with books, supplies, and tools covered the remaining walls. Everything was clean and organized, but it felt more like a workshop than a home. Jonah stood at the stove, stirring something in a dented tin pot. He'd already been up for hours. She could tell by the way the fire was burning steady and hot, and by the fact that he was fully dressed in his work clothes. He glanced over when she emerged from the bedroom, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he said curtly. "Coffee's ready. Can't say it's fit for children, but it's what I've got." Ellie approached the table cautiously, unsure of the morning protocols in this strange new place. "Thank you, Mr. Creek. I don't mind coffee. Mama used to give me some with lots of milk when I helped with morning chores. Something flickered across Jonah's face at the mention of her mother, but he turned back to the stove without comment. He filled 2 tin cups with the dark, bitter-smelling brew and set one in front of her. The coffee was indeed strong, stronger than anything she'd ever tasted, but she sipped it without complaint, grateful for the warmth. "You said you helped with chores," Jonah said, settling into the chair across from her. His large hands dwarfed the coffee cup, and she noticed the scars that crisscrossed his knuckles. "What kind of work did you do?" "I helped Mama with the garden and the chickens. I can gather eggs and milk goats. I know how to preserve vegetables and mend clothes." Ellie sat up straighter, eager to prove her usefulness. "I can read and write too. Mama taught me from the Bible and her recipe book." Jonah nodded slowly, studying her over the rim of his cup. "Those are good skills, practical, but mountain living is different from homestead farming. Harder, more dangerous." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Ellie said firmly, "and I'm not afraid of danger either. Mama always said courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you are scared." Despite himself, Jonah found himself impressed by the child's resolve. Most adults he'd known lacked that kind of clear-eyed determination. "Your mama sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was the best mama in the whole world." Ellie's voice grew soft. She used to say that every day was a gift, even the hard ones, especially the hard ones. The silence that followed was comfortable rather than awkward, filled with the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of birds beginning their morning songs. Jonah finished his coffee and stood up, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Well then," he said, "if you're going to be here for the day, you might as well learn something useful. Mountain survival starts with knowing your surroundings." He led her outside into the crisp morning air, where everything sparkled with dew. The mountains rose around them like sleeping giants, their peaks touched with gold from the rising sun. Ellie had thought the view from her family's cabin was beautiful, but this was something altogether different, wild and vast and magnificent in a way that made her feel both tiny and infinite at the same time. "First rule," Jonah said, his voice taking on the tone of someone accustomed to teaching, though he seemed surprised by his own instruction. "Always know where your water comes from." He led her to a small creek that wound through the trees behind the cabin, its water clear and cold as it tumbled over smooth stones. "This stream feeds my well and waters my garden. In winter, when it freezes, I have to melt snow. Water is life up here, more important than food, more important than fire." Ellie knelt beside the stream and cupped the water in her palms, tasting its sweetness. "It's so clean." The water near our cabin was good, but not like this. Mountain water's different, cleaner, but you still have to be careful. Animals use the same streams, and some places the water can make you sick. He pointed upstream, where the creek disappeared around a bend. "I know every inch of this water source for 2 miles in each direction. That's what it takes to survive." They spent the morning walking the boundaries of what Jonah considered his territory. He showed her the signs that warned of bear activity, the places where deer came to drink, the rocky outcroppings that provided shelter from storms. His knowledge was encyclopedic and precise, accumulated over 15 years of solitary living. "Why did you come here?" Ellie asked as they paused at a high overlook that commanded a view of 3 valleys. "Why so far from other people?" Jonah was quiet for a long time, his eyes fixed on the distant peaks. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Sometimes a man needs to get away from his past. Start over. The mountains don't judge. They just let you be. Did something bad happen to you?" The question was innocent, asked with the frank curiosity of a child, but Jonah felt it like a physical blow. Images flashed through his mind, faces he'd tried to forget, choices he'd made, the man he used to be before he learned that some things can't be undone. "Everyone's got things they'd rather not talk about," he said finally. "Part of growing up is learning when to ask questions and when to let sleeping dogs lie." Ellie nodded solemnly. though she filed the information away for later consideration. She was beginning to understand that Jonah Creek was a man of layers, and that the gruff exterior was just the surface of something much more complex. They returned to the cabin as the sun reached its zenith, and Jonah put her to work helping with the daily tasks that kept his small homestead running. She gathered eggs from his chickens, helped him tend the garden, and assisted with repairs to a section of fence that had been damaged by a recent storm. The work was harder than what she was used to, but she threw herself into it with determination, eager to prove her worth. "You're stronger than you look," Jonah admitted as they stacked the last of the firewood. "And you listen well. That's important up here. Not listening can get you killed." Ellie glowed under the praise, even as she felt the ache of muscles unaccustomed to such labor. "Mama always said that the best way to learn is to pay attention and keep your mouth shut until you know what you're talking about." For the first time since she'd arrived, Jonah almost smiled. "Smart woman, your mama." As the afternoon wore on, Ellie found herself watching Jonah with growing fascination. He moved through his domain with the confidence of someone completely at home in his environment, every action purposeful and efficient. But there was something else too, a carefulness in the way he explained things to her, a patience she sensed he didn't often exercise. When evening began to paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, they sat on the cabin's small porch, sharing a simple dinner of bread and stew. The food was plain but filling, seasoned with herbs from Jonah's garden and cooked in the same dented pot that had held their morning coffee. "This is good," Ellie said, savoring the warmth of the meal. "Different from Mama's cooking, but good. Food tastes better when you're hungry and tired," Jonah replied. "That's another mountain lesson." As darkness crept across the valley, Ellie realized with a growing sense of dread that her promised day was nearly over. Tomorrow, she would have to leave this place and continue her search for somewhere to belong. The thought filled her with a loneliness so profound it took her breath away. But for now, sitting beside this quiet, mysterious man, as the stars began to appear overhead, she felt something she hadn't experienced since her mother died. The simple comfort of not being alone. As the fire in the hearth settled into glowing embers, Ellie sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully removing her worn shoes. The leather was cracked and thin, and she could feel where her toes had pushed through the fabric lining. These boots had belonged to her mother first, and even with rags stuffed in the toes, they were still too big for Ellie's small feet. "Those won't last another week," Jonah observed from his chair, where he was cleaning and oiling a hunting knife with practiced precision. The blade caught the firelight as he worked, and Ellie found herself mesmerized by the careful way he tended the tool. "They've lasted this long," she said, though even she could hear the doubt in her voice. "Mama always said we make do with what we have." Jonah set down the knife and really looked at her for the first time since she'd arrived. The patched dress, the too large shoes, the way she tried to make herself small and unobtrusive, it all painted a picture of a child who had learned early that resources were scarce and complaints were a luxury she couldn't afford. "Tell me about your life before," he said suddenly. "Your mama, your home. How did you end up alone out here?" Ellie tucked her feet under her dress and wrapped her arms around her knees, her rag doll resting against her chest. "Papa died when I was 5, cave-in at the mine where he worked. After that, it was just me and Mama. We had a little cabin about 30 miles south of here, near Silver Creek. I know that area. Good farming land, but isolated. Mama said she liked the quiet. She said after Papa died, she needed space to think and heal." Ellie's voice grew soft with memory. "She taught me everything. How to read and write, how to tend a garden, how to preserve food for winter. She had this little book where she wrote down all her recipes and remedies, said it was important to pass down what you know." Jonah leaned forward slightly, his interest caught despite himself. "What kind of remedies?" "Oh, all sorts of things. Tea made from willow bark for headaches, honey and lemon for coughs, poultices for cuts and burns." Ellie brightened, happy to talk about something her mother had known well. She could deliver babies too. Sometimes women from other homesteads would send for her when their time came. Sounds like she was the local healer. She never called herself that, but I guess that's what she was. She always said that helping people was just what neighbors did for each other. Ellie's expression grew sad. When she got sick, there wasn't anyone close enough to help us. She tried her own remedies, but the fever was too strong. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. Jonah had seen enough death in his life to recognize the weight this child carried, the way loss could age someone beyond their years. "How long have you been alone up here?" Ellie asked suddenly, sensing that he might be willing to share if she was brave enough to ask. Jonah's hand stilled on the knife handle. It had been so long since anyone had asked him personal questions that he'd almost forgotten how to deflect them. But something about this child's direct gaze and honest curiosity made him want to answer. 15 years, give or take. Came up here when I was about 25. He resumed his careful cleaning of the blade. It seemed like a good place to disappear. What were you disappearing from? The question hung in the air between them, loaded, with implications Ellie was too young to fully understand. Jonah studied her face in the firelight, seeing no judgment there, only genuine interest. "I used to be a different kind of man," he said finally. "Made my living with my gun, if you take my meaning. There was a time when my name meant something in certain circles, something dangerous." Ellie absorbed this information without fear, though she sensed the gravity of what he was telling her. "Were you an outlaw?" "Not exactly. More like..." He paused, searching for words that would be honest without being too harsh for young ears. "I was the kind of man other men hired when they had problems that needed solving permanently. I was good at it. Too good." "What changed?" Jonah set down the knife and stared into the fire, seeing ghosts in the dancing flames. "I realized that being good at killing doesn't make you a good man. Eventually, you have to look at yourself in the mirror and decide what kind of person you want to be. I didn't much like what I saw." "So you came here to become someone else?" "I came here to stop being anyone at all. The mountains don't care about your past. They only care about whether you can survive today." Ellie considered this, her young mind working to understand the complexities of adult choices and consequences. "Do you ever miss it? Your old life?" "I miss some things," Jonah admitted. "The money was good. There was a kind of respect that came with having a reputation. But mostly I don't miss it. That life was like a poison. The more you tasted, the more it changed you. Mama used to say that people can change if they really want to. She said everyone deserves a chance to start over. Your mama was a wise woman. But the world isn't always that forgiving. Some things you can't undo, no matter how much you want to." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. It was the kind of peaceful evening that made the outside world seem very far. "Away, Mr. Creek," Ellie said eventually. "Just Jonah. Mr. Creek makes me sound older than dirt." She smiled at that. "Jonah, are you lonely up here?" The question caught him off guard with its simplicity and directness. He'd spent 15 years convincing himself that solitude was what he wanted, that isolation was the price of peace. But sitting here with this child, sharing stories and watching her small face in the firelight, he felt something he'd almost forgotten, the warmth of human connection. "I thought I preferred it," he said quietly. "Loneliness seemed safer than the alternative." "What's the alternative?" "Caring about people. When you care about someone, you have something to lose. And losing people." He trailed off, remembering faces from his past, choices that had cost him more than he could bear. "But if you don't care about anyone, don't you lose something anyway?" Ellie asked with the insight that sometimes comes naturally to children. "Don't you lose yourself?" Jonah looked at her with something approaching wonder. Here was a child who had lost everything, her father, her mother, her home, her security, and yet she still believed in the value of human connection. She still had hope. "How did someone so young get to be so wise?" he asked. Mama always said that losing people doesn't mean you should stop loving them. It just means you have to carry their love with you wherever you go. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both of the vast wilderness that surrounded this small pocket of warmth and safety. Ellie's eyes grew heavy, the emotional weight of the day finally catching up with her. "You should get some sleep," Jonah said gently. "Tomorrow will come soon enough." But as Ellie curled up on her cot with her rag doll, both of them were thinking the same thing. Tomorrow would mean goodbye, and neither of them was ready for that. The second morning dawned grey and threatening, with low clouds obscuring the mountain peaks and the smell of rain heavy in the air. Ellie woke to the sound of Jonah moving around the cabin with more urgency than usual, and when she emerged from the small bedroom, she found him checking the latches on the shutters and securing loose items that might blow away in a storm. "Weather's coming in," he said without preamble. "Big one, by the look of it. Could last a day or two." Ellie looked out the window at the darkening sky, her heart sinking. She was supposed to leave today, but even she could see that traveling in a mountain storm would be dangerous, if not impossible. "Does this mean—" "It means you're staying put until it passes," Jonah said curtly, though she noticed he didn't seem particularly upset by this development. "Mountain storms aren't something to take lightly. I've seen grown men die from being caught in the wrong place when the weather turns." Relief flooded through Ellie, even as she tried to hide it. She had dreaded this morning, dreaded having to pack her few belongings and set off into the wilderness again. Now, the storm had given her a reprieve, a few more days in this place that was beginning to feel like safety. As if reading her thoughts, Jonah added gruffly, "Don't go getting comfortable. Soon as the weather clears, you're on your way." But his tone lacked conviction, and Ellie was beginning to understand the man well enough to recognize when his words didn't match his feelings. The storm hit just after breakfast, announcing itself, with a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the entire mountain. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the trees with a ferocity that made the sturdy cabin feel suddenly fragile. Ellie had never experienced weather quite like this. The storms near her old home had been tame by comparison. "Is it always like this?" she asked, pressing her face to the window to watch the trees bend and sway. "Mountain storms are different," Jonah explained, adding another log to the fire. "They come fast and hit hard. The elevation makes them more intense, and the valleys can channel the wind like a funnel." As if to emphasize his point, a particularly strong gust rattled the shutters and sent something crashing in the yard outside. Ellie jumped and, without thinking, moved closer to Jonah's chair. He noticed the movement but didn't comment, instead pulling out a small wooden box from a shelf beside the fireplace. "Might as well make use of the time," he said, opening the box to reveal her mother's small recipe book, along with a few other items she'd packed. "You mentioned your mama's remedies. Show me what she taught you." Ellie's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. She'd been so careful with her few possessions, afraid to take them out where they might be damaged or lost. But Jonah was offering her the chance to share something precious, something that connected her to her mother. She opened the book carefully, its pages yellowed but still legible in her mother's careful handwriting. "This one's for fever," she said, pointing to a recipe that called for willow bark and mint. "And this one's for burns, honey and aloe, if you can find it." Jonah leaned forward to study the page, and Ellie caught the scent of wood smoke and leather that seemed to cling to him. "Your mama had good instincts. Willow bark's got the same properties as what the doctors call aspirin. Honey's a natural antiseptic. You know about medicine. A man living alone learns a bit of everything, or he doesn't live long." Jonah turned the page, revealing more recipes written in Sarah's careful script. "These are valuable. Knowledge like this isn't found in many places." They spent the morning going through the book page by page, with Jonah asking questions about ingredients and methods, while Ellie shared the stories her mother had told about each remedy. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, Something warm and companionable was growing between them. "This one's interesting," Jonah said, pointing to a recipe for a poultice made from pine pitch and herbs. "I've used something similar for deep cuts. Where did your mama learn about pine pitch?" "From her grandmother, who learned it from the Blackfoot. Indians," Mama said. "Her family traded with them sometimes, and they shared knowledge about healing." Ellie's voice grew proud. She said learning from other people made you stronger, not weaker. "Smart woman," Jonah murmured, and Ellie glowed under the praise for her mother. As the day wore on, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to intensify, with thunder rolling almost continuously overhead and rain coming down so hard it sounded like gravel thrown against the windows. But Ellie found she wasn't afraid anymore. The cabin felt solid and secure, and Jonah's calm presence made the wild weather seem more exciting than terrifying. Around midday, they heard a different sound cutting through the storm, the desperate lowing of cattle in distress. Jonah's head snapped up immediately, his body going tense with alertness. "That's not good," he said, rising from his chair and moving to the window. "Sounds like someone's stock got loose in the storm." Ellie joined him at the window, peering out into the grey chaos. Through the driving rain, she could make out dark shapes moving in the trees, cattle, confused and panicked, being driven by the wind and rain. "Shouldn't we help them?" she asked. Jonah hesitated, clearly torn between his instinct to stay safe and dry and something else, a sense of responsibility that he'd thought he'd left behind with his old life. Those animals could die out there. The storm could drive them right off a cliff. Without another word, he pulled on his heavy coat and hat. "You stay here by the fire. Keep it fed, and don't open the door for anyone but me. I want to help," Ellie said immediately, moving toward her own thin shawl. "Absolutely not. This is dangerous work, and that storm will knock you flat in 10 seconds. But I know about cattle. I helped Mama when the Henderson stock got loose last spring, and you said yourself, 2 people can do more than one." Jonah looked down at her determined face, seeing the stubborn set of her jaw that reminded him so much of her mother's courage. Against his better judgment, he found himself considering it. The truth was, he could use the help, and the child had proven herself surprisingly capable. "If you come, you do exactly what I say, when I say it. No questions, no arguments, understood?" Ellie nodded eagerly, already wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. "And you stay close to me at all times. This storm could separate us, and I won't lose track of you in this weather." They stepped out into the fury of the mountain storm, and Ellie immediately understood why Jonah had been reluctant to bring her. The wind hit her like a physical blow, and the rain soaked through her clothes in seconds. But she gritted her teeth and stayed close to Jonah's broad back as he led the way toward the panicked cattle. What followed was an hour of the most challenging work Ellie had ever experienced. The cattle were scattered and frightened, made dangerous by their panic. Working together, she and Jonah managed to gather most of them into a makeshift shelter formed by fallen trees and rock outcroppings. Ellie proved invaluable in calming the animals, her small size and gentle voice somehow reaching them in ways that Jonah's larger presence couldn't. By the time they returned to the cabin, both of them were soaked to the bone and exhausted, but triumphant. They'd saved nearly a dozen head of cattle from certain death in the storm. "You did good out there," Jonah said as they peeled off their wet clothes by the fire. "Better than good. You got instincts for this kind of work." Ellie beamed under his praise, feeling a pride she hadn't experienced since her mother's death. For the first time in weeks, she felt useful, capable, like she had something valuable to contribute. As they sat by the fire warming themselves and sharing hot soup, Jonah found himself looking at this small girl with new eyes. She wasn't just a lost child in need of charity. She was strong, brave, and surprisingly resourceful. The kind of person who could be a real partner in the hard work of mountain living. The thought scared him more than he cared to admit. The storm raged for 3 more days, trapping Ellie and Jonah together in the small cabin while the mountain unleashed its fury outside. But what had started as an inconvenience gradually transformed into something neither of them had expected. A glimpse of what life could be like when 2 people worked together instead of struggling alone. On the 3rd morning, as they sat drinking coffee and listening to the rain drum against the roof, Jonah pulled something from his pocket and set it on the table between them. It was an old pocket watch, its silver case tarnished and its crystal face cracked. But when Ellie looked closer, she could see that the hands had stopped moving long ago. "This was my father's," Jonah said quietly, running his thumb over the worn case. "He gave it to me when I left home, said it would help me keep track of time so I wouldn't lose my way." Ellie leaned forward to examine the watch more closely. "It's beautiful. Why doesn't it work anymore?" "Stop the day I decided to become someone I wasn't meant to be." Jonah's voice was heavy with old regret. "I always told myself I'd get it fixed someday, but somehow 15 years passed and I never did. Maybe it stopped because you stopped." "Believing in time," Ellie said, with the startling insight that sometimes came from children. "Mama used to say that time only matters when you have somewhere to go and someone to be." Jonah looked at her with surprise. "And what do you think that means?" "I think it means you've been hiding from time instead of living in it, but time's not the enemy, loneliness is." The words hit Jonah like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He'd spent 15 years convincing himself that isolation was safety, that wanting nothing meant losing nothing. But this child, with her simple wisdom and unshakable faith in human connection, was showing him the flaw in his thinking. "You're too young to understand some things," he said. But his heart wasn't in the protest. "Maybe, but I understand that. You're the kindest person I've met since Mama died, and you're trying real hard to pretend you're not." Before Jonah could respond, they heard a sound that made them both freeze, the distant crack of a rifle shot, followed by another. The shots were coming from somewhere up the valley, too close to be hunting and too deliberate to be accidental. Jonah was on his feet instantly, moving to the window and peering out through the rain. His entire demeanor had changed. The relaxed man she'd been talking with replaced by someone alert and dangerous. "Stay away from the windows," he ordered, his voice sharp with authority. "And keep quiet." "What is it?" Ellie whispered. But she obeyed immediately, pressing herself against the wall beside the fireplace. Trouble, most likely. The kind that finds men who thought they'd left their past behind. More shots echoed through the valley, closer now, and Jonah moved with sudden purpose to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. When he opened it, Ellie gasped. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were weapons, a rifle, 2 pistols, and a gun belt that looked like it had seen hard use. "I thought you left that life behind," she said, watching as he unwrapped the weapons with practiced efficiency. "Some things follow you whether you want them to or not." Jonah checked the rifle's action with the smooth movements of someone who had done this countless times. "I'd hoped I was far enough away, hidden well enough," but he trailed off as the sound of horses approached through the rain. Multiple riders, moving with purpose rather than wandering. Jonah cursed under his breath and moved to a different window, one that gave him a view of the trail leading to his cabin. "Listen to me very carefully," he said without turning around. "There's a root cellar under the trap door by the back wall. If I tell you to hide, you go down there and you don't. Come out until I say it's safe, no matter what you hear up here. Do you understand?" Ellie nodded, her heart pounding. She'd never seen Jonah like this, focused and deadly serious. Every muscle in his body coiled for action. It was like watching a different person emerge from beneath the gentle mountain man. She'd come to know. "Who are they?" she whispered. "Men I used to know, men who probably think I have something they want." Jonah's jaw was tight with tension. "Or maybe they're here because someone put a price on old debts." The riders came into view through the rain. 3 men on horseback, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, but their posture speaking of violence and bad intentions. They rode with the casual arrogance of men who were used to taking what they wanted and leaving destruction in their wake. Jonah recognized them immediately, and his blood ran cold. Jake Morrison, Deadeye Pete, and Carlos Mendez, three of the most ruthless men he'd ever known, and former associates from his days as a gun for hire. If they were here, it meant his carefully constructed new life was about to come crashing. "Down! Jonah Creek!" one of them called out, his voice carrying clearly through the rain. "We know you're in there. Come on out and let's have ourselves a talk." Jonah closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of 15 years of peace slipping away. When he opened them again, his face was hard as granite. "The cellar," he told Ellie. "Now. But what about you?" "I'll handle this. That's what I do." He helped her lift the heavy trapdoor, revealing a small underground space stocked with preserved food and supplies. "Whatever happens, you stay hidden. Until it's over." Ellie climbed down into the cellar, but before Jonah could close the door, she reached up and grabbed his hand. "Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't become someone you don't want to be." Jonah looked down at her upturned face, seeing fear and faith warring in her blue eyes. "I promise I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." It wasn't the promise she'd asked for, but it was the only one he could make. As he lowered the trapdoor and covered it with a rug, Jonah felt the familiar weight of his gun belt around his waist and the cold certainty that his past had finally caught. Up with him. Outside, the men were growing impatient, their voices taking on the edge that preceded violence. Jonah Creek, the peaceful mountain man, was about to die, and in his place would stand the man he used to be, the man he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. But as he moved toward the door, he carried with him something he'd never had in his old life, something worth fighting for, someone worth protecting. And that, he realized, changed everything. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle. When Jonah stepped onto his porch, the rifle held casually in his hands, but ready to be raised in an instant. The three men sat their horses in a semicircle around his cabin, water streaming from there, at brims and their faces hard with the kind of patience that came from years of hunting other men. Jake Morrison, the leader, was exactly as Jonah remembered him, tall and lean, with pale eyes that missed nothing and a smile that never reached beyond his mouth. The wanted poster crumpled in Jake's saddlebag bore Jonah's old name and a reward that had only grown larger with time. Ghost Walker Creek, wanted dead or alive, 5,000 reward. "Well, well," Jake drawled, his voice carrying the lazy menace of a rattlesnake. "If it isn't the famous Ghost Walker Creek playing house in the mountains, you're a hard man to find, Jonah." Not hard enough, apparently. Jonah kept his voice level, his body relaxed despite the tension coiling in his muscles. "What do you want, Jake?" "What do I want?" Jake laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "That's a hell of a question coming from you. You cost me a lot of money. When you disappeared, partner, a lot of money and a lot of reputation." Deadeye Pete, squat and barrel-chested with fingers that never strayed far from his guns, spat into the mud. 15 years we've been looking for you, Creek. 15 years of following cold trails and empty leads." "Should have looked harder," Jonah replied. "Or maybe you should have learned to let sleeping dogs lie." Carlos Mendez, the youngest of the three, but arguably the most dangerous, leaned forward in his saddle. "You killed our boss, you son of a bitch, shot him down in cold blood and rode off with $20,000 that belonged to all of us. Vincent Cross was scum. And you all knew it." Jonah's voice hardened. He had it coming, and that money was payment for services he never intended to render. "Maybe so," Jake said, his hand drifting toward his gun. "But that don't change the fact that you left us holding the bag when the law came calling. 3 of our boys died in the shootout that followed. Good men don't ride with Vincent Cross." The conversation was following a script that Jonah knew by heart, the careful dance of accusations and justifications that preceded violence between men who had once trusted each other with their lives. But something was different this time. For the first time in his career as a gunfighter, Jonah had something more important than his own survival to consider. In the cellar beneath his feet, Ellie was hiding in the dark, trusting him to protect her, The thought of her small face, so full of faith in his goodness, gave him strength he hadn't known he possessed. "So what's it going to be?" Jake asked, his patience finally wearing thin. "You going to come along peaceful-like, or do we have to do this the hard way?" "There's a third option," Jonah said quietly. "Yeah? What's that?" "You ride away. Right now. Forget you ever found me, and I'll forget I ever knew you." Jake's laugh was sharp and bitter. "And why the hell would we do that? You're worth $5,000, dead or alive. That's good money, even split 3 ways. Because I'm not the man I used to be," Jonah said, and for the first time he realized he truly meant it. "I don't want to kill you, Jake, any of you. But I will, if you force my hand." "You're out of practice, old man," Deadeye Pete said with a sneer. "Been playing farmer too long. Lost your edge." Jonah's eyes went cold, and suddenly the 3 men could see the ghost of the legendary gunfighter they'd once known. "You want to test that theory, Pete? Be my guest." The standoff stretched taut as a wire, with rain pattering softly on the cabin roof and the horses shifting restlessly beneath their riders. In the cellar, Ellie pressed her ear to the floorboards, trying to make sense of the muffled voices above. It was Carlos who broke first, his youth and hot temper overriding his caution. His hand flashed toward his gun with the speed that had made him feared throughout the territory. But Jonah was faster than he'd been 15 years ago, faster than should have been possible for a man who claimed to be out of practice. The rifle came up and fired in one smooth motion, and Carlos tumbled from his saddle with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder. His gun spun away into the mud, useless. "Next one goes through your heart," Jonah said calmly, working the rifle's action to chamber another round. "Your choice." Jake's eyes narrowed, reassessing the situation. He'd seen Jonah shoot before, but this was something different. This wasn't the cold, mechanical precision of a professional killer. This was the deadly accuracy of a man protecting something precious. "You always were fast," Jake admitted. "But there's still 3 of us and 1 of you, and we ain't leaving without that bounty money." "Then you'll die here," Jonah said simply. "All of you, because I'm not going anywhere." Deadeye Pete's hand twitched toward his gun, but Jake held up a warning finger. Something had changed in the dynamic, and he was smart enough to recognize it. This wasn't the Ghostwalker Creek he'd known, the man who fought for money and reputation and the simple pleasure of being the best at what he did. This was someone fighting for something more important than his own life. "What happened to you?" "Up here," Jake asked, genuine curiosity coloring his voice. "What could possibly be worth dying for in this God-forsaken wilderness?" Jonah's answer was simple and absolute. Family. The word hit Jake like a physical blow. In all the years he'd known Jonah Creek, the man had never claimed attachment to anything or anyone. He'd been a ghost, a lone wolf, a man who moved through the world without leaving tracks or forming bonds. "Family?" Deadeye Pete laughed harshly. You ain't got no family, Creek never did." "I do now," Jonah said, and the quiet conviction in his voice silenced Pete's mockery. Jake studied Jonah's face, seeing something there he'd never seen before. Peace, purpose, and the kind of fierce protectiveness that could make even a rational man do irrational things. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake said softly. "The great Ghostwalker Creek, gone domestic, something like that." In the cellar, Ellie held her breath, her small hands pressed against her mouth to keep from making any sound. She could hear the voices more clearly now, could make out the tension and barely controlled violence in every word. But she could also hear something else in Jonah's voice, an unwavering determination to protect her, no matter the cost. The standoff stretched on, with rain beginning to fall harder again and the lights starting to fade from the grey sky. 3 desperate men with guns faced off against one man who had found something worth fighting for. And in the balance hung the future of a small girl who had already lost everything once and couldn't bear to lose it again. The afternoon light was failing fast, casting long shadows across the clearing as the standoff continued. Jonah could feel the familiar weight of his gun belt around his waist, the leather worn smooth from years of use, but the man wearing it was different from the one who had once earned his living with those weapons. Below the floorboards, Ellie pressed herself against the earthen wall of the root cellar. Her mother's rag doll clutched tight against her chest. She could hear every word now, and the picture forming in her mind was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Jonah, the gentle mountain man who had taught her about gardens and shown her kindness, was someone else entirely, someone dangerous, someone with a past full of violence and death, but he was still the man who had given her shelter when she had nowhere else to go. Still the man who had shared his coffee and his stories and looked at her like she mattered. And now he was risking everything to protect her from men who wanted to drag him back to a life he'd left behind. "You know, Creek," Jake said, shifting. In his saddle, as his horse grew restless beneath him, "there might be a way out of this that don't end with shooting." Jonah's finger remained steady on the rifle's trigger, but he tilted his head slightly to indicate he was listening. "You got something we want," Jake continued, "but maybe we got something you want too." "I doubt that. Information." Jake's smile was cold as winter. "About that bounty on your head. About who's been asking questions. About why certain people in certain places have been very interested in tracking down the Ghost Walker Creek after all these years." Despite himself, Jonah felt a flicker of interest. He'd always wondered how they'd found him, wondered who had the resources and the motivation to keep looking after 15 years, keep talking. "Marcus Kane," Jake said, and watched as recognition flickered across Jonah's face. "Remember him? Vincent Cross's business partner, the one who got away when you shot up their operation." Jonah's jaw tightened. Marcus Kane, smart, ruthless, and patient as death itself. If Kane was behind this, it meant the past wasn't finished with him yet. "Kane's built himself quite an empire since you disappeared," Deadeye Pete added, "apparently recovered from Carlos's shooting. Runs half the territory now, from Denver to Sacramento, and he's got a long memory for people who cost him money." "So he sent you to collect," Jonah said. "Not exactly." Jake's smile widened. "He sent us to bring you back alive. Seems he wants to have a personal conversation about old times before he puts you in the ground." The implications hit Jonah like a physical blow. If Kane wanted him alive, it meant torture, meant a slow death designed to satisfy 15 years of patient hatred. It meant leaving Ellie alone and defenseless in a world that didn't care about orphaned children. "Here's my counteroffer," Jonah said, his voice deadly quiet. "You ride away now, and I won't kill all three of you where you sit." "Can't do that, partner," Jake said with mock regret. "We got our orders, and Marcus Kane ain't the forgiving type when it comes to failure." In the cellar, Ellie could hear the conversation taking an even darker turn. She understood enough to know that these men wanted to take Jonah away, wanted to hurt him for things he'd done in his past life. The thought filled her with a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. Without making a conscious decision, she began to move quietly through the small underground space, feeling along the walls until she found what she was looking for, the narrow tunnel that Jonah had shown her earlier, the one that led to an emergency exit behind the cabin. He'd built it years ago as a precaution, never thinking he'd need to use it to protect someone else. Above ground, the tension was reaching a breaking point. Carlos had managed to bind his wounded shoulder and was back on his feet, his good hand hovering near his backup pistol. The three men were positioning themselves strategically, preparing for the violence they all knew was coming. "Last chance." "Creek," Jake said. "Come along peaceful, and we'll make it quick at the end. Keep fighting, and Kane's going to take his time with you." Jonah's response was to shift his aim slightly, the rifle now pointing directly at Jake's chest. "I told you, I'm not going anywhere, even if it means dying for some stranger's kid." The question hung in the air like smoke, and Jonah realized they knew about Ellie. They'd been watching, gathering information, planning this moment carefully, which meant they were even more dangerous than he'd thought. "She's not some stranger's kid," Jonah said quietly. "She's mine now." The words surprised him as much as they surprised the three men facing him. Somewhere over the past few days, without his even realizing it, Ellie had become more than a lost child he was helping. She'd become family, the daughter he'd never had, the future he'd never allowed himself to imagine. "Touching," Deadeye Pete sneered, "but dead men don't have families." It was then that Ellie emerged from the emergency tunnel, moving with the silent grace her mother had taught her when they used to play hiding games. She circled around behind the three riders, her small size and the fading light making her nearly invisible. She'd brought something with her from the cabin, Jonah's backup rifle, the one he kept loaded and ready near the back door. It was heavy, in her small hands, and she had to brace it against a tree to keep it steady, but her mother had taught her to shoot when she was 6 years old. "A woman alone needs to know how to protect herself," Sarah had said, and those lessons were about to prove invaluable. Jonah caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision and felt his heart stop. Ellie was supposed to be safe in the cellar, not creeping around behind 3 armed killers with a rifle she could barely lift. "I said the kid stays out of this," he called out, trying to warn the men without giving away Ellie's position. "Kid," Jake's head swiveled, searching the shadows. What kid? It was the opening Jonah had been waiting for. As Jake's attention wavered, Jonah's rifle spoke, the bullet taking Deadeye Pete in the shoulder and spinning him from his saddle. The man hit the ground hard, his own weapon flying into the darkness. Jake cursed and drew his pistol, but Jonah was already moving, using the cabin's porch for cover as he worked the rifle's action. Carlos, despite his wounded shoulder, managed to get his backup gun clear and sent a shot splintering the wood near Jonah's head. "Stay down!" Jonah shouted to Ellie, hoping she could hear him over the gunfire. "Whatever happens, stay down." But Ellie had other plans. As Jake wheeled his horse around, trying to get a clear shot at Jonah, she stepped out from behind her tree and leveled the rifle at the outlaw leader. "Don't you hurt him," she said, her young voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Don't you dare hurt him." Jake's eyes went wide as he found himself staring down the barrel of a rifle held by a child who couldn't be more than 8 years old. The incongruity of the situation, this small girl with her fierce blue eyes and steady hands, threw him off balance for a crucial moment. "Well, I'll be damned," he said softly. "The kid's got teeth, more than teeth," Ellie replied, and Jonah heard an echo of her mother's strength in her voice. "My mama taught me to shoot, and Jonah taught me when it's right to use a gun. And when's that, little girl? When someone tries to hurt your family?" The word hung between them like a bridge, family, and suddenly everything was clear. They weren't just two people thrown together by circumstance anymore. They were something more, something worth fighting for, something worth dying for. And in that moment, as the mountain evening darkened around them and violence hung in the air like thunder, both Jonah and Ellie understood that this fight would determine not just their survival, but their future together. The moment stretched taut as a wire, with Ellie holding the heavy rifle steady despite her small frame, and Jake Morrison staring down its barrel with the dawning realization that his carefully laid plans had just gone to hell. Around her neck, her mother's locket caught the last rays of sunlight, a small silver reminder of love and innocence in a moment filled with violence. "Easy there, little girl," Jake said, his voice taking on the false calm of a man trying to talk his way out of trouble. "You don't want to do something you'll regret." "I already regret plenty," Ellie replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I regret that my mama died. I regret that I had to walk these mountains alone, but I won't regret protecting the only family I have left." Behind her, Jonah felt something break apart in his chest, not from pain, but from a fierce pride he'd never experienced before. This brave little girl, who'd lost everything and still chose courage over surrender, was calling him family, was willing to risk her life to protect him. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 15 years, he'd isolated himself to avoid exactly this kind of situation, caring about someone enough that their safety mattered more than his own survival. But now, watching Ellie face down 3 killers with nothing but determination and her mother's teachings, he realized that isolation hadn't made him stronger, it had made him empty. "Ellie," he called softly, never taking his eyes off Carlos, who was still trying to work his way into position for a clear shot. "I need you to trust me now, just like you did that first day." "I do trust you," she said, her small voice carrying absolute conviction. "Then when I say run, you drop that rifle and get back to the tunnel. Don't look back, don't hesitate. Can you do that for me?" "But no buts. Promise me." Ellie's grip tightened on the rifle, but she nodded. "I promise." What happened next unfolded with the deadly precision of a man who had once been the most feared gunfighter in 3 territories. Jake, thinking he saw an opportunity in the exchange between Jonah and Ellie, made the mistake of shifting his aim toward the child. He never got the chance to fire. Jonah's rifle spoke first, the bullet taking Jake's center mass and tumbling him from his saddle. Before the man even hit the ground, Jonah was moving, working the rifle's action as he rolled off the porch and into the cover of the woodpile. "Run!" he shouted to Ellie. Carlos, panicked and bleeding from his shoulder wound, fired wildly in Jonah's direction, his shots splintering wood and sending bark flying from the nearby trees. But panic made him careless, and Jonah's return shot caught him in the leg, dropping him to his knees with a cry of pain. Deadeye Pete, despite his own wound, had managed to crawl behind his fallen horse and was trying to bring his backup pistol to bear. His shot came close enough to Jonah's head that he felt the wind of the bullet's passage, but close only counted with horseshoes and hand grenades. Jonah's final shot was a thing of terrible beauty, smooth, precise, and absolutely final. Pete's weapon flew from nerveless fingers as he toppled backward into the mud. His threat ended forever. The sudden silence that followed the gunfire was deafening. Smoke drifted across the clearing, and the acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the clean mountain air. 3 men lay motionless in the mud, their horses scattered and confused by the violence. Jonah remained in cover for a long moment, listening for any sound that might indicate another threat. When he was satisfied that the danger had passed, he slowly stood, his rifle still ready, but no longer pointed at immediate targets. "Ellie," he called. "I'm here." Her voice came from the direction of the tunnel, small and shaken, but unharmed. Relief flooded through Jonah like a physical force, leaving him momentarily weak-kneed. She was safe. They were both safe. The past had tried to reclaim him, but it had failed. As Ellie emerged from her hiding place, Jonah could see the shock beginning to set in. She had witnessed violence unlike anything in her young life, had seen him kill 3 men with the cold efficiency of a professional. He braced himself for her fear, for the inevitable realization that the gentle mountain man she trusted was also a killer. Instead, she ran to him, her small arms wrapping around his waist as tears finally came. "I was so scared," she sobbed against his chest. "I thought they were going to take you away." Jonah dropped his rifle and held her close, his large hands gentle on her small back. "It's over," he said softly. "It's over, and we're both safe." But even as he spoke the words, he knew that something fundamental had changed between them. She had seen him for what he truly was, not just the peaceful mountain man, but the ghost walker Creek, who had once made his living with death. And she had chosen to stand with him anyway. That choice, made by a child in a moment of desperate courage, meant more to him than any reputation he had ever earned with his guns. They stood together in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the aftermath of violence, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and cool, but the clearing bore the scars of what had just happened. Churned, mud, scattered weapons, and 3 still forms that had once been men with names and histories and choices that led them to this place. Jonah looked down at Ellie, still wrapped in his arms, and felt something crack open inside his chest. Not his ribs or his heart, but something deeper. The carefully constructed walls he'd built around his emotions 15 years ago. She was looking up at him with those bright blue eyes, And instead of the fear he'd expected to see, there was something else entirely. "Are you afraid of me now?" he asked quietly, the question carrying the weight of every dark deed in his past. Ellie pulled back slightly to study his face, her small hand coming up to touch the scar that ran along his jawline, a souvenir from his old life that she'd never asked about before. "Should I be?" The question was asked with the directness that only children possessed, cutting straight through pretense to the heart of the matter. Jonah considered it seriously, looking at his hands, hands that had just killed 3 men, hands that had dealt death more times than he cared to count. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've done terrible things, Ellie, things I can never undo. The man I used to be—" "But you're not him anymore," she interrupted with startling conviction. "The man who shot those men, that wasn't the same person who taught me about gardens and shared his coffee with me. That was someone else, someone who came back to protect me." Her words hit him with the force of revelation. She understood, in the way that children sometimes could, that people weren't just one thing, that the capacity for violence could exist, alongside the capacity for gentleness, that darkness and light could inhabit the same heart. "How can you be so sure?" he asked. Ellie reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, folded and worn from handling. When she unfolded it, Jonah saw that it was a drawing, crude in the way of children's art, but unmistakably depicting the 2 of them standing in front of the cabin, with flowers and trees and a smiling sun overhead. "I drew this yesterday morning, while you were splitting wood," she said. "I was going to give it to you before I had to leave, but then the storm came and everything changed." Jonah took the drawing with hands that trembled slightly, studying the simple figures she had created. In her version of their life, they were both smiling, both belonging to the same picture, the same story. "This is how you see us?" he asked. "This is how we are," she said firmly. "A family. The man in this picture is the real you, the one who matters. The other one, the one with the guns, he was just protecting us." The wisdom in her words shamed him. Here was a child who had lost everything, who had witnessed violence and death, and yet she could still see past the darkness to something worth preserving. She could separate the man he was becoming from the man he had been. "I was so scared you would send me away," Ellie continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "When I heard those men talking about your past, about the things you used to do, I thought you might decide I was too much trouble, too dangerous to keep around." Jonah knelt down so they were at eye level, his large hands gentle on her small shoulders. "Listen to me very carefully," he said. "Nothing, and I mean nothing, could make me send you away. What happened here today, what those men said about my past, none of that changes how I feel about you." "How do you feel about me?" she asked, and he could hear the need for reassurance in her voice, the deep hunger for belonging that every orphan child carried. "I love you," he said simply, and the words came easier than he'd expected. "I love you like you're my own daughter, like you've always been my daughter." Tears spilled down Ellie's cheeks, but they were tears of relief and joy rather than sorrow. "I love you too," she whispered. "I love you like you're my real papa." They held each other as the first stars appeared overhead. 2 people who had found something precious in each other, the family they'd both needed but never known they were looking for. The violence was over, the threat eliminated, but more importantly, the fear was gone too. The fear that they didn't really belong together, that this was just a temporary arrangement born of circumstance and convenience. "What happens now?" Ellie asked as they finally pulled apart. Jonah looked around the clearing, taking in the practical matters that would need to be addressed. The bodies would have to be buried, the horses cared for, the cabin secured. But beyond the immediate concerns, there was a larger question about their future together. "Now we go home," he said. "We clean up this mess, and then we start building the life we want to live. Together? Together, for as long as you want to stay." Ellie smiled through her tears, remembering her desperate question from that first day. "Can I spend a day with you?" Now she knew the answer was bigger than she'd ever dared to hope. "Forever," she said. "I want to stay forever." And in that moment, Jonah Creek, former gunfighter, hermit and man running from his past, finally understood what it meant to have a future worth fighting for. 6 weeks later, the mountain valley had settled back into its peaceful rhythm, as if the violence that had shattered one evening had been absorbed by the vast wilderness and transformed into something else, a story, a memory, a foundation upon which new life could be built. Ellie stood on the hill behind the cabin, her hands dirty from planting wildflowers around the simple wooden cross that Jonah had carved for her mother's memorial. He had spent 3 days working on it, his large hands surprisingly delicate as he shaped the pine into something worthy of Sarah Morrison's memory. Now it stood among the aspens, weathered grey by mountain storms, but solid as the love it represented. "I think she would have liked him, Mama," Ellie said softly, her voice carrying on the cool morning breeze. "He's nothing like Papa was." Papa was gentle all the way through, never raised his voice or his hand to anybody. But Jonah's got gentleness too, just buried deeper, and he loves me something fierce, just like you did. She arranged the last of the lupins around the base of the cross, the purple flowers bright against the dark earth. These were the same wildflowers she'd been picking that last morning with her mother, before fever changed everything. Now they grew here too, a bridge between her old life and her new one. "He wants to adopt me proper," she continued, settling back on her heels to admire her. "Work. Says he's going to ride into town and talk to the territorial judge, make it all legal-like, so nobody can ever say I don't belong with him. I told him we don't need papers to be family, but he says he wants to do it right. Says you deserve to. Know your daughter is properly cared for." The sound of footsteps on the path made her turn, and she saw Jonah approaching with 2 steaming cups of coffee. He'd taken to bringing her morning coffee whenever she came up here to tend the memorial, understanding without being told that these moments with her mother were sacred. "Morning, Sarah," he said quietly, addressing the cross as he handed Ellie a cup. "Hope you don't mind me borrowing your daughter for another day." It had become his habit, these one-sided conversations with Ellie's mother. At first, Ellie had found it strange, but now she treasured these moments when Jonah acknowledged the woman who had shaped her into the person she was becoming. "I've been thinking about what you said," Ellie said, accepting the warm cup gratefully, "about making it legal, and I want to do it. Not because I need papers to know you're my family, but because I want the whole world to know. I want to be Ellie Creek, daughter of Jonah Creek. I want it written down somewhere official that we belong to each other." Jonah felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Your mama's name was Morrison. You sure you want to give that up?" "I'm not giving it up. Sarah Morrison will always be my mama, and I'll always carry her love with me. But she's gone, and you're here. You're the one who's going to watch me grow up and teach me how to be strong and walk me down the aisle someday, if I ever find someone fool enough to marry me." "Anyone would be lucky to have you," Jonah said gruffly. "Maybe, but they'll have to get past you first, and that's going to take some doing." They laughed together, the sound carrying across the valley like a promise. Below them the cabin looked small and peaceful in the morning light, smoke rising from the chimney and chickens scratching in the yard. It looked like home, not just a place to live, but a place where people belonged to each other. "I had a letter from the territorial capital yesterday," Jonah said, "from the marshal's office." Ellie tensed slightly. Even though Jake Morrison and his partners were buried on the far side of the valley, the threat they had represented still cast occasional shadows over their newfound peace. What did it say? "Marcus Kane is dead. Shot down in Denver 2 weeks ago by a man whose family he'd destroyed. Seems like he made a lot of enemies over the years, and his luck finally ran out." Relief flooded through Ellie like warm honey. She hadn't realized how much she'd been worrying about other men coming after them until the worry was gone. "Does that mean it's really over?" "It means the past is finally buried where it belongs," Jonah said. "We can stop looking over our shoulders and start looking ahead." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the peaks that surrounded their valley. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called to its mate, and the sound was answered from across the canyon, a wild conversation that spoke of partnership and belonging. "Jonah," Ellie said eventually, "yeah, remember that first day when I asked if I could spend a day with you? I remember. I was so scared you'd say no. All I wanted was one day somewhere safe. One day where I didn't have to be afraid. I never dreamed you'd give me forever." Jonah reached out and took her small hand in his large one, feeling the calluses she'd developed from learning to work alongside him, the strength that was growing in her small frame. "You know what the funny thing is?" he said. "When you asked that question, I thought I was the one doing the favor, thought I was being charitable, giving shelter to a lost child. Turns out you were the one doing the giving. What did I give you? A reason to stop running. A reason to be the man I always should have been, instead of the man I was." He squeezed her hand gently. "You gave me a family, Ellie. You gave me a future." As they walked back down the hill together, Ellie felt the presence of her mother, like a warm hand on her shoulder, blessing this new chapter of her story. Sarah Morrison had taught her to be brave, to hope even in the darkest moments, to believe that good people existed even when the world seemed cruel. And she had been right. Somewhere in these mountains, a lost little girl had found exactly what she'd been looking for, not just shelter from the storm, but a home that would last forever. Behind them, the wildflowers nodded in the mountain breeze, purple petals catching the morning light like promises kept and love that endures beyond memory. The memorial would weather many seasons, would see snow and rain and the turning of years, but it would stand as a testament to the truth that some bonds can never be broken, and some families are chosen by the heart rather than by blood. In the distance, the peaks rose eternal and unchanging, witnesses to a story that had begun with loss and fear, but had transformed into something beautiful. The simple, profound miracle of two people who had found each other when they needed it most, and who had chosen to build a life together based on love, trust, and the unshakable conviction that everyone deserves a place to belong. "You can stay forever," Jonah had said, and he had meant it with every fiber of his being. But what he hadn't understood then, and what he knew with absolute certainty now, was that forever had always been the plan. Not just his plan, but something larger. Something that had been written in the stars long before a scared little girl asked a gruff mountain man for just one day of kindness. Some stories end with goodbye. This one ended with hello. Hello to tomorrow, hello to family, hello to the endless possibility that comes when two hearts choose to trust each other with. The future, forever, was just the beginning.